On a calm afternoon in Los Angeles, the streets were busy but not overly crowded. Snoop Dogg, the famous rapper and entrepreneur, was driving through a well-known neighborhood. He wasn't rushing, just enjoying the day, thinking about his upcoming business plans, and maybe even planning to visit a few friends. The sun was shining, and the breeze felt nice as he cruised down the street. Suddenly, behind him, the flashing blue lights of a police car appeared in his rearview mirror. It wasn't unusual for celebrities to get stopped by the police now and then, but Snoop didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just a random check, or the officer needed to ask him a quick question. He slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, as most drivers do when they see those flashing lights. As the car came to a full stop, Snoop kept his hands on the steering wheel, his eyes focused on the rearview mirror, waiting for the officer to approach. He could see the officer walking toward him, tall and confident, but Snoop could also tell something wasn't quite right. The officer's eyes seemed to linger a bit longer than usual. Maybe it was the car Snoop was driving, sleek, black, and clearly expensive, or maybe it was just Snoop himself. Either way, there was a tension in the air that didn't feel normal. The officer reached Snoop's window and knocked on the glass. Snoop rolled the window down slowly, flashing a calm smile. "Good afternoon, officer," he said politely, though he had a feeling this wouldn't be like the usual quick stop. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, his voice firm and cold. "No, officer. Was I speeding?" Snoop responded, genuinely unsure of what had caused the stop. He had been driving within the speed limit and hadn't seen any signs of trouble. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at Snoop for a long moment, as if sizing him up. There was something about the officer's demeanor that felt off. "I'm pulling you over because you look like you're up to something," the officer said finally, his tone full of judgment. Snoop's eyebrows raised. "Excuse me." "I'm asking you to step out of the car," the officer demanded. "I want to search your vehicle." Snoop could hardly believe his ears. He wasn't sure what the officer was getting at, but it was clear that something wasn't right. He had been stopped many times before, but never for such a strange reason. The officer hadn't explained why he thought Snoop was up to something, nor had he offered any real reason for the search. "I haven't done anything wrong," Snoop replied, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have the right to search my car without a good reason." But the officer wasn't interested in hearing Snoop's side of the story. He had already made up his mind. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, his tone growing colder. "I'm going to search the trunk." Snoop paused for a moment, considering his options. He could argue, but that might make the situation worse. Instead, he decided to remain calm, knowing that losing his cool wouldn't help anyone. "All right," he said, opening the door and stepping out. "Go ahead, search my car. I know my rights." The officer gestured toward the trunk and began walking around to the back of the car, not even waiting for Snoop to open it. The tension between them was palpable, and a small crowd started to gather at the side of the road. People were watching, sensing that something unusual was going on. As the officer stood by the trunk, Snoop felt a mix of frustration and confusion. What was it that made the officer so determined to search his car? What had he done to deserve this? Snoop didn't know, but he had a feeling this wasn't just about his car. It was about who he was. As the officer walked around to the back of the car, Snoop could feel the weight of the situation settling in. He stood still, watching the officer's every move. The officer didn't seem to be in any rush, but there was a tense energy in the air. Snoop knew something was wrong, but he wasn't sure exactly what. He had been in this situation before, but never like this. Never with someone who seemed so sure, so focused on him as if he had done something wrong just by existing. "Open the trunk," the officer ordered sharply, his voice echoing in the quiet of the street. There was no politeness in his tone, no curiosity, only an expectation of obedience. It was clear the officer had made up his mind before even approaching Snoop's car. Snoop hesitated for a moment, but then walked around to the back of his car, where the officer stood waiting. He popped the trunk and stepped back, letting the officer inspect it. Snoop knew his rights, but the last thing he wanted was to make things worse. His mind raced. Why was this officer acting like this? Was it because of his fame? Was it the color of his skin? Or was it just that the officer had decided that Snoop was someone to suspect, based on nothing more than assumptions? As the officer began pulling things out of the trunk, old bags, sports equipment, and other personal belongings, he seemed to be looking for something specific, something to prove his theory that Snoop was up to no good. But there was nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Snoop had packed light for the day, nothing in the trunk that could raise any real suspicion. Yet, the officer continued his search with a focused intensity, as if searching for something that just wasn't there. Snoop stood there, trying to keep calm. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, people standing at a distance, whispering among themselves. Some looked confused, some looked frustrated, but all of them seemed to sense that something wasn't quite right. "You're wasting your time," Snoop said quietly, but the officer didn't acknowledge him. The officer's hands moved quickly through the belongings, pulling out every item, checking it like he was hoping to find something that would justify the stop. Snoop was well known for his music, his business ventures, and his personality, but none of that meant he deserved to be treated this way. The crowd grew a little larger as more people gathered to see what was going on. Some were watching with curiosity, but others were clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was unfolding. Snoop noticed a few people shaking their heads, clearly disapproving of the way the officer was handling things. The officer didn't speak for a while. He just kept going through the trunk, tossing aside items with no real care. Snoop couldn't help but wonder what the officer thought he would find. Did he expect to find something illegal? Was the officer just hoping to cause trouble? Snoop couldn't understand why he was being treated like this. Finally, the officer straightened up, his face showing signs of frustration. There was no surprise in what he had found. Just ordinary, everyday items. Nothing that could even hint at the officer's earlier accusations. "I don't know what you're hoping to find," Snoop said again, this time with a little more edge to his voice. "I don't have anything to hide." The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood there, looking at Snoop, his face hard and unreadable. It was clear now that Snoop had become the target of this officer's bias, a bias that wasn't based on any facts, but on assumptions and stereotypes. Snoop looked around at the crowd, his calm and composed demeanor drawing the attention of more people. They could see it now, the unfairness, the unnecessary targeting of someone based on nothing but their appearance. It wasn't just happening to Snoop, it was happening to many people every day. The officer stood still for a moment, staring at Snoop as if he were trying to decide what to do next. Snoop kept his expression calm, though inside, he was growing frustrated. It was becoming more and more clear that this wasn't just about a simple traffic stop. This officer had already decided that something wasn't right, and no matter what Snoop did or said, the officer seemed determined to find a reason to make trouble. Snoop shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying not to show how annoyed he felt. He had nothing to hide, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. He glanced at the small crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk. Some were watching in silence, others were murmuring quietly to each other. Snoop could feel their eyes on him. They could all see that the officer wasn't acting like he should. The officer finally broke the silence, his voice sharp. "I need you to open your trunk," he said again, as if the words would somehow make Snoop's compliance easier. Snoop's jaw tightened. He knew the officer didn't have a legal reason to ask for the trunk to be opened, but he also knew arguing might make things worse. So instead of resisting, he simply nodded and walked to the back of the car. With a slight click, he popped the trunk and stepped back, crossing his arms. The officer, with a sense of authority, moved quickly to the back of the car and began peering into the trunk. Snoop watched silently as the officer started going through his personal belongings, his gym bag, a few clothes, and some paperwork. The officer's hands moved quickly, tossing aside each item as if he expected to find something hidden under the bags or somewhere between the clothes. Snoop had never felt so uncomfortable. He had been stopped by officers before, but this situation was different. This officer's treatment felt harsh, unnecessary, and based on nothing but assumptions. Snoop was trying to remain calm, reminding himself that reacting angrily wouldn't help. But deep down, he was angry. He didn't deserve this kind of treatment. No one did. As the officer searched, Snoop glanced around at the people who were still watching. Some were whispering to each other, their eyes wide with disbelief. They could see what was happening, how the officer was treating Snoop differently, not because of anything he had done, but simply because of who he was. It wasn't just about being a celebrity. It was about the way the officer had already decided that Snoop was guilty of something, even before looking for any evidence. The officer's face was focused, his eyes scanning every item in the trunk, pulling them out and inspecting them as if searching for some hidden secret. But there was nothing strange in the trunk, just the usual things anyone might carry around. Shoes, a few bags, a hat. There was no reason for suspicion. Yet the officer kept searching, as though he had made up his mind long ago that something wasn't right. Snoop could feel the anger bubbling up, but he held it in check. This was a test, he told himself. If he lost his cool now, he'd only give the officer more reasons to escalate the situation. So he stayed calm and kept his eyes on the officer, who had now started checking under the floor mats of the trunk. "You sure you want to keep doing this?" Snoop asked, his voice steady but firm. "There's nothing here but my stuff." The officer didn't look up or acknowledge him. Instead, he just continued his search, determined to find something, anything, to justify his actions. Snoop could feel the tension rising with every moment that passed. The officer wasn't even pretending anymore to be looking for something specific. It was clear that he just wanted to dig deeper, perhaps hoping that he would eventually find something to make this whole stop seem worthwhile. But there was nothing. The officer had been going through Snoop's trunk for what felt like an eternity. He pulled out one item after another, clothes, bags, even a few old records. There was no sign of anything unusual, no evidence of anything that could justify the search. Yet the officer didn't seem ready to stop. It was as if he was determined to keep looking, hoping that something would appear that would make his stop seem reasonable. Snoop stood there, his arms crossed, watching the officer's every move. The frustration was building inside him, but he refused to let it show. He knew that getting angry would only make things worse, but it wasn't easy. He had every right to be upset. He had been pulled over without cause, treated unfairly, and now the officer was invading his privacy, searching through his things without any real reason. As the officer reached into a bag in the back of the trunk, his hand brushed against something hard. He paused, a look of interest flashing across his face. He pulled the object out slowly, holding it up to examine it. It was an old guitar, one that Snoop had used on stage for several of his performances. The officer looked at it for a moment, as if it held some kind of mystery. Snoop could see the officer's confusion. It wasn't the kind of thing he would expect to find in the trunk of someone he was profiling. The guitar wasn't illegal or dangerous, but it didn't fit the officer's assumptions of what a suspicious person might be carrying. The officer looked from the guitar to Snoop, clearly thrown off by the discovery. He seemed to be at a loss for words for a moment, but he didn't stop his search. Snoop couldn't help but feel a slight sense of satisfaction. It was almost as if the officer's expectations were being shattered, piece by piece. The officer had probably imagined finding something like drugs or weapons, something to justify his suspicion. But instead, he was pulling out normal, harmless items, things that had no business being inspected at all. "Anything else you want to find in there?" Snoop asked, his tone calm but laced with a hint of sarcasm. "I've got a lot of stuff, but nothing that's going to help you out." The officer didn't respond right away. He just set the guitar down on the ground, his eyes lingering on it for a second longer than necessary. He turned back to the trunk and continued his search, as if the guitar hadn't interrupted his mission. By now, Snoop's patience was wearing thin, but he didn't show it. He simply stood there, waiting for the officer to finish. As the officer continued to sift through his belongings, Snoop noticed that the crowd had grown larger. People were now standing across the street, watching the situation unfold. There were whispers in the air, and Snoop could tell that the onlookers were starting to realize what was happening. They could see that Snoop was being treated unfairly, targeted based on assumptions rather than any real evidence. The officer pulled out a few more items, just more ordinary things. A couple of jackets, some shoes, and a few bags with no noticeable contents. Each item was placed aside. And still, nothing even came close to what the officer was hoping for. Snoop watched as the officer's frustration began to show. He was becoming more and more flustered, his movements quicker and more careless as he dug through the trunk. Snoop took a deep breath, his mind racing. How much longer would this go on? It was clear now that the officer wasn't just doing his job. He was making assumptions, playing out a scene in his head that had nothing to do with the reality of the situation. And as time passed, the situation only grew more and more ridiculous. This wasn't just about a car being searched. It was about something deeper, a system that targeted people based on their appearance, their background, and their identity. And now, everyone watching could see it too. As the officer continued to pull out items from Snoop's trunk, his frustration became more apparent. He was looking through bags, tossing aside jackets, shoes, and a few old personal items, all while Snoop stood there, calm but clearly annoyed. It was obvious now that the officer wasn't going to find anything that could justify his actions, but he didn't seem ready to give up. Each item he pulled out was a reminder of how unnecessary this search was, how unfair it was to treat someone like this based on nothing but assumptions. The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger. People were starting to talk quietly among themselves, their eyes moving back and forth between Snoop and the officer. Some were shaking their heads, others seemed confused, and a few were even starting to look angry. They could all see the same thing. Snoop was being treated unfairly for no reason other than the officer's biased assumptions. It was as if the officer had decided from the start that Snoop was guilty, and now he was grasping at anything to make that seem true. Snoop, however, wasn't about to let the officer get the best of him. He stood there, arms crossed, waiting for the officer to finish. His expression was calm, but inside, he couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. It was 2023, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of his skin and the car he drove. It was a reminder that the fight for fairness wasn't over, and people still faced unnecessary challenges because of their identity. The officer, now clearly losing his patience, turned back to Snoop. "What's this?" he demanded, holding up a small bag with what looked like personal items. "Is this yours?" Snoop glanced at the bag. "Yeah, that's mine. It's just some things I keep with me. Nothing special." The officer seemed to hesitate for a moment before putting the bag back down without further inspection. For the first time during this stop, the officer seemed unsure of himself. He had been expecting to find something, anything, that would make his assumptions about Snoop seem valid. But now, with every item he pulled out of the trunk, the more ridiculous the situation became. Snoop could see it in the officer's eyes. The man was starting to realize that he had made a huge mistake. The officer had started this search with a certain confidence, believing that he would find something illegal, something that could justify the stop. But now, that confidence was gone, replaced with uncertainty. The officer's shoulders slumped slightly, and his eyes flickered between the items in the trunk and Snoop. He was beginning to understand that he had been wrong all along. The crowd watched in silence, sensing the shift in the officer's demeanor. It was clear to them, too, that this wasn't about finding anything illegal. It was about something much deeper. The officer had assumed Snoop was guilty simply because of who he was, and now, standing before him, was the evidence that his assumptions had been completely unfounded. Snoop stood tall, his expression still calm. He had been patient through this whole ordeal, but now, As the officer seemed to falter, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. Not because of anything he had done, but because the officer's own actions were exposing the truth. The officer, realizing that there was nothing left to search through, stepped back from the trunk. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at the items scattered on the ground. Snoop didn't speak either, but the silence between them spoke volumes. It was a silence that held the weight of everything that had just happened. A silence filled with the uncomfortable truth that the officer's actions had been based on nothing but bias and assumptions. The silence between Snoop and the officer stretched on. The officer took a step back from the trunk, his expression slowly changing. What had started as an intense search now seemed like a failure. He had gone through Snoop's belongings, looking for something that simply wasn't there. Now, with his hands empty, he was forced to confront the truth. There was nothing wrong, nothing to justify the stop, and certainly nothing illegal in Snoop's trunk. Snoop stood quietly, his gaze unwavering. He had been calm through the entire process, despite the frustration building inside him. He had known from the beginning that this wasn't about the items in his trunk. It was never about what was inside his car. This whole situation had been about something much bigger, a judgment made based solely on who he was and how the officer saw him. The officer looked around, clearly unsure of how to proceed. He glanced down at the items that had been scattered across the ground, some of them still untouched. The guitar, the jackets, the bags, they were all harmless, everyday objects. But to the officer, they had been part of his investigation, part of the idea he had created in his mind about Snoop and his intentions. Now, the officer was starting to realize that he had been wrong. He had made an assumption based on nothing but Snoop's appearance and the car he was driving. And in doing so, he had crossed a line. His confidence was gone, replaced by a sense of unease. For a moment, he seemed unsure of what to say next. The crowd watching from a distance had grown quiet too. They had been silent observers at first, but now they could see what was happening. They could see the officer's realization, his discomfort as he realized that he had overstepped. It was as if the truth had finally dawned on him, and he was left standing there, unsure of what to do next. Snoop, still standing tall, didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The officer's actions had already spoken for him. The crowd, which had once been watching in silence, now began to murmur among themselves. They could see the injustice, the unfair treatment Snoop had faced simply because of who he was. And they could see that the officer's actions had been based on assumptions and biases, not on anything real. After a few moments, the officer took a deep breath and looked at Snoop, his face a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. I don't see anything," the officer muttered, more to himself than to Snoop. His words were an admission, a quiet acceptance of the fact that the search had been pointless. Snoop finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You had no reason to stop me in the first place. You didn't have the right to search my car." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But I'll let you go this time. Don't make this mistake again." The officer didn't respond right away. He just nodded slowly, his eyes avoiding Snoop's. He had no words to defend his actions, no excuse for the way he had treated Snoop. The silence between them was now filled with the uncomfortable truth that the officer had been wrong. Snoop stepped back, ready to get back in his car. He had been patient through this entire ordeal, but it was clear that there was no reason to stay any longer. As he opened the door and slid into his seat, he couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and frustration. The officer had learned nothing from this experience, and the crowd, while silent, had witnessed the unfairness of the situation. As Snoop started his car and drove away, he couldn't help but think about how many people had been treated like this, day after day. How many others had been stopped, searched, and judged simply because of the way they looked. He didn't know the answer, but he knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about a bigger issue, a problem that needed to be fixed. Word of the incident spread quickly. What had started as a random traffic stop quickly turned into a story that captured the attention of many. News outlets began reporting on the situation, and soon, social media was buzzing with posts and reactions. People were shocked, outraged even, by the way Snoop Dogg had been treated by the officer. The story spread like wildfire, and the situation became a talking point everywhere, from local coffee shops to national news networks. Snoop himself didn't make a big fuss about it. He stayed calm throughout the ordeal, but once the story was out there, it was clear that the public wasn't going to let it slide. It wasn't just about him. It was about a larger issue, an issue that many people had been dealing with for far too long. Racial profiling, unjust treatment based on assumptions, and the unfair targeting of people because of their appearance were problems that needed to be addressed. The story caught the attention of activists, celebrities, and ordinary people who had experienced similar situations. Many shared their own stories of being unfairly targeted or treated with suspicion because of their race. The incident gave them a voice, a platform to speak out against something that had been happening for far too long. Snoop was no stranger to public attention, but this time, the attention was different. It wasn't about his music or his career. It was about his experience with the police. People were listening, and they were starting to understand the weight of what had happened. The officer's actions had shone a light on the harsh reality of racial bias and how it could affect anyone, regardless of who they were. The police department, too, had to address the situation. Internal investigations were launched, and the officer who had stopped Snoop came under scrutiny. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist. The department knew that they couldn't ignore the public outcry. It was clear that people were watching, and they expected justice. The officer's actions raised serious questions about police training, racial profiling, and the way law enforcement treated people of color. The fallout wasn't just felt by the officer, it was felt by the entire community. Snoop's response to the situation was measured. He didn't want to make things worse, but he also knew this was a moment to speak up. He used his platform to call for change, to ask for better treatment for everyone, no matter their background or appearance. "This is bigger than me," Snoop said in one of his interviews. "This is about making sure people are treated fairly, no matter who they are or where they come from." The crowd that had gathered during the traffic stop had seen everything unfold before them. Now, they were speaking out too. More and more people were sharing their own stories of being unfairly treated by the police, and it became clear that Snoop's experience was not an isolated one. It was part of a bigger issue that needed to be addressed. The officer's mistake had sparked a conversation that needed to happen. People were coming together, discussing the problem, and demanding action. The incident wasn't just about a single traffic stop anymore. It was about a movement for justice and equality. The public had spoken, and it was clear they were not going to let this issue slide. Snoop, though, stayed focused on the bigger picture. He wasn't going to let the situation define him. Instead, he used it as a moment to help make a change. He knew that while this incident was tough, it had the power to spark something much bigger, a movement for fairness, respect, and equality. As the story of Snoop Dogg's unjust treatment by the officer continued to spread, the public response was powerful and immediate. People from all walks of life, whether they were fans of Snoop or not, began to express their support. Social media posts flooded in, with many using hashtags like #JusticeForSnoop and #EndRacialProfiling to spread awareness. What had seemed like a small incident quickly turned into a national conversation about racial bias and the treatment of people of color by law enforcement. Celebrities and public figures stood behind Snoop, using their platforms to speak out against the officer's actions. They shared their own stories of unfair treatment, and many called for change within police departments across the country. Musicians, actors, athletes, and activists all rallied together to shine a light on the issue. It wasn't just about one traffic stop. It was about years of inequality and mistreatment. The incident also sparked a broader conversation in the media. News outlets began covering the story from multiple angles, discussing the systemic issues that allowed situations like this to happen. Interviews with legal experts, Activists and community leaders appeared on television, all calling for police reform and better training to prevent racial profiling. It became clear that the incident had struck a nerve, not just in the communities directly affected, but with people across the nation who were tired of seeing this kind of injustice repeated. Snoop Dogg, despite being the victim of this unfair treatment, became a symbol for change. His calm demeanor during the stop and his measured response afterward were praised. He didn't lash out or make the situation worse. Instead, he used the experience as a platform to push for a larger conversation about fairness and respect for all people. His voice, along with those of many others, began to shift the conversation in the right direction. On the local level, the police department faced increasing pressure to address the issue. The public was demanding accountability. The officer involved in the incident was placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation took place. Many wondered if this incident would lead to actual change within the department or if it would be swept under the rug, as so many others had been. The department was under intense scrutiny, and the outcome of the investigation would set a precedent for how seriously they took issues of racial profiling. Across the country, protests and rallies began to take place, with people marching for justice and equal treatment under the law. Snoop, however, continued to call for peaceful dialogue and reform. He wasn't interested in adding fuel to the fire with anger or violence. He wanted to use his voice to inspire change. He called on leaders to listen to the voices of those who had been marginalized for so long and to make meaningful changes in how law enforcement interacted with the public. The officer's actions had sparked an important conversation, and Snoop's experience had become a turning point. People were no longer silent about racial profiling. They were no longer willing to accept it as a part of everyday life. And thanks to the attention Snoop's story received, there was now a real chance for meaningful change to take place. As the investigation continued and the public's pressure grew, it became clear that this was just the beginning of a much larger movement, a movement for equality, justice, and respect for all people, no matter their background. The story of the traffic stop quickly became a symbol for the larger conversation about racial profiling and inequality in law enforcement. The fallout from the incident didn't just end with the officer's actions. It sparked a wave of change, both within the community and across the country. People from all walks of life were now talking about what had happened, and they were demanding justice. Snoop Dogg's calm response during the entire ordeal became a powerful example of how to handle injustice with dignity. Instead of getting angry or escalating the situation, he chose to stand firm, using his voice to demand fairness. His actions had inspired others to speak out, to share their own stories of being treated unfairly, and to call for change. His words in interviews about the need for respect and equal treatment resonated with many, and he became an unexpected leader in the movement for justice. The police department was under intense pressure to address the situation. The internal investigation continued, and many wondered if real change would come from this. The officer who had stopped Snoop was placed on administrative leave, while the department evaluated the situation. People were watching closely, waiting to see if the department would take meaningful action or if the incident would be swept under the rug like so many before it. The officer's actions had brought to light a larger issue that couldn't be ignored any longer. Across the country, there was a growing sense of frustration with the way law enforcement treated people of color. The incident was a reminder of the systemic issues that had been in place for years. Protests, rallies, and peaceful demonstrations began to take place in cities all over the nation. People were coming together to demand that law enforcement agencies make real changes, including better training on racial bias, more accountability, and greater transparency. The focus of the conversation shifted toward reform, with calls for better policies that would address the root causes of racial profiling and discrimination. Activists, community leaders, and even everyday citizens started to push for changes that would ensure no one would have to face what Snoop Dogg had experienced that day. The conversation was no longer about just one officer. It was about transforming a system that had allowed racial bias to exist for too long. Meanwhile, Snoop continued to speak out, using his platform to raise awareness and keep the conversation going. He wasn't just a celebrity now. He was a voice for change. He made sure to remind people that this wasn't just about one individual. It was about all the people who had been unfairly targeted, all the people who had been judged based on their appearance, their background, or their race. As the weeks passed, more conversations about police reform and racial equality took place. Lawmakers began to discuss potential policies that could address these issues at a national level. The pressure from the public, and from people like Snoop Dogg, who had chosen to speak out rather than stay silent, helped drive the discussion forward. The officer involved in the traffic stop eventually faced consequences for his actions, though it was unclear whether it would lead to lasting change within the department. What was clear, however, was that the incident had sparked something much bigger than just a personal experience. It had started a movement for justice, equality, and respect for all people, no matter their race, background, or appearance. Snoop's calmness in the face of injustice, his decision to speak out instead of stay silent, had made a real difference. It wasn't just about one moment in time. It was about changing the way people thought, the way people acted, and the way the system treated those who had long been marginalized. And while the journey for real change was just beginning, it was a journey that had been started by many voices coming together, all calling for a better, fairer world.